I'm here to show you guys the best vocal chain that you should be using in 2024 and beyond. It's tried and true. It always works. So let's get into it. What's good, guys? I'm Inswain with Inswain Audio. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new, make sure to subscribe and stick around because I drop videos just like this every single day. There's not many doing it like this. You're not going to want to miss out. Welcome. Let's get into this vocal chain. All right, first things first, I need to preface by saying this is not something you should copy one-to-one always. There is no one vocal chain that's going to work all the time. That's just not a real thing. I don't care how good it is. It's never going to always work. You need to switch it up and use your ears, and it's going to be variable. Everything in mixing is always variable depending on what's coming in, changes what you got to do to get the result coming out. But this is a really great general guideline, and I'm going to give you the philosophy of why this chain works a lot of times and where you might fluctuate, and you're going to learn a lot from this. So although you might not be copying it one-to-one all the time, you can take the mindset and learn how to mold it a little bit to fit your song that you're working with. All right, so with that out of the way, let's start. First thing you're going to want to do is tuning, if necessary. This depends on the genre, the performance, the artist themselves. There's a million variables on whether you want to tune or not. Some artists like tuning, some don't. I'm not here to have that debate. That's not what this video is about. But if you're going to tune, you usually want to put it first because the more processing you do, the more you're altering the signal. And if you feed that altered signal into your tuning plugin, it may throw it off and tune it incorrectly. Now, like I said, everything's variable. Sometimes you have a super varied source that is going to throw off the tuning plugin, so you want to process a little bit to get it more, controlled before it touches the tuning. So like I said, everything in here is going to change, but that's when you would, move your tuning around. But for most cases with a semi-decent recording, you're going to want to do this earlier on in the chain. Whether this is Melodyne or a Melodyne type plugin like manual tuning or auto tune or an automatic type of tuning. These would go first. Some of them do both. Sometimes you're going to want to do some manual tuning with Melodyne for some more natural, problem fixing. And then you would put the auto tune style tuning right after that to get the hard effect. That works too. There's a million ways to do this, but generally speaking, you're going to want to do your tuning first to use the raw unprocessed signal to feed that into the tuning plugin, get it tuned up and sort of prepped for the actual mixing stage. All right, next is where you're most likely going to want to do your EQ. Or more specifically, your subtractive EQ, right? We want to be attenuating, fixing, or removing problems earlier on in the chain because as we get down later in the chain, we're going to be enhancing things and boosting and adding, and we don't want to be adding, boosting, and enhancing to things that we find unpleasant. So the overarching philosophy is fix problems first, then enhance what's left. So we want to do EQ earlier on, more of a subtractive EQ. That's not to say you can't do some boosts or that you have to do subtractive EQ, right? Like I said, this is all very variable, but generally speaking, you want to reduce or attenuate those problem frequencies early on so that later on in the chain, they're not building up. Next, we're going to be wanting to do our compression, right? Usually vocals are very dynamic. Almost all vocals are going to need some sort of compression, if not multiple, if not a ton of compression, whether in tracking, mixing, wherever. A lot of compression goes on a typical vocal, especially in today's day and age. This is where you'd want to do it earlier in the chain. Now, there's a whole debate on if you should compress or EQ first. I have a video of that on my channel. There is no right answer. Sometimes you compress before you EQ. Sometimes you EQ before you compress. Sometimes you compress, then EQ, then compress, then EQ again. There's no right or wrong answer. It depends. But in most cases, in a vacuum, generally speaking, you want to remove some of the bad frequencies so that they're not triggering the compressor unnaturally in ways that you don't want. That's my philosophy behind why I would EQ before compression. But sometimes you want to compress to get the signal nice and tight before you EQ, right? You just got to kind of think about how these things are going to react because the order you do things in does matter. A lot of times I'm doing two compressors, two different ones doing different things at different speeds. That's a separate video. But whether you do one compressor, two compressors, 97 compressors, this is generally where you'd want to do that in your chain. Okay, here at this point is where things really start to get variable, and there's really a lot of different ways you could take it. Most of the time, generally speaking, this would be a good place to do your de-essing. Once you've EQ'd it and compressed it, it's generally how it's going to be. It's a little bland, but there's not going to be any huge sweeping changes at this point. So it's a good idea to de-ess here. You can also de-ess at the end of your chain, at the beginning. Some people like to do it at the beginning and the end. I've done it all. It all works. It all depends. But this is a good spot to de-ess because most of the processing that we're doing in terms of tonality and frequency has already been done. and dynamic range. So now is a good time to de-ess because we're not doing any more huge sweeping changes from this point. So try to throw your de-esser here. Next up, we're getting even further down the chain. It's getting even more variable, but this is a pretty good spot where you would do your saturation. Now that we have our bad frequencies removed, the dynamics are controlled, our S's are tamed, now we can do some saturation. You could do your de-esser after the saturation, right? You could do saturation then de-essing, because the saturation might add in S's that you'd want to attenuate, or you could think of it as, I want to attenuate my S's and sibilants before I hit the saturation so that they don't get exaggerated. There's all different sorts of thinking, and it's always going to change, and both are good depending on what your source is. But most of the time, I like to take control of my S's before they go into my saturator, and they're going to be driving the saturator harder than anything else, and that sibilance is just going to get compounded on and exponentially increased. So I kind of want to tame it before the saturation, but it's honestly a toss-up. There's many times where I'm saturating because there is no sibilance. I saturate, then it comes out, then just put a de-esser to tame it. It's okay. Like I said, this part of the chain is very variable. I'm just giving you a general breakdown so you know where to start and the philosophy behind it, which is the biggest takeaway. This is where we're really molding the vocal to sound and feel the way we want it, and to get that texture and tone that we want. This part, like I said, is very variable. Some people like to do this before the saturation, sometimes it's after. I'm about 50-50, but now is where we do our tone shaping EQ, or our, what I like to call broad moves EQ, generally boosting EQ. So earlier on in the chain, we did more surgical, reductive EQ to fix problems. Now that the problems are gone, now we can do some boost. We can find what we like and boost it a little bit. At this stage, it's very common to use analog emulated EQs as opposed to, parametric transparent ones that are really digitally. These add some nice character so you don't need to do huge moves. Here, think wide boosts of just a dB-ish. This is very generally speaking, it really depends. You can cut here, you can cut narrowly, you can boost narrowly, but generally speaking, this is our tone shaping EQ. We're not changing the vocal a huge amount, we're just shaping the tone a little bit, just getting it, squeezing a little bit more out of it that we want. You could do this before your saturation so that the saturation finds those boosts and accentuates them even more, or you can get your tone from your saturation and then finish it off with EQ. Like I said, it's very variable at this point, but I like to do it here towards the end. Once I got everything how I want it, now I'll do some tone shaping, but I've done this earlier in the chain a lot and then saturate at the end. Anyone that's telling you to follow a step-by-step guide to mix a vocal, it's bad advice. That's why I'm giving you general advice, and hopefully you can take the philosophy from it, as well as the reasoning as to why things go in the order that they may go in. Okay, at this point in the chain, we're getting towards the end. We're pretty much done with processing on the main chain. Anything extra you may need, like multiband compression, more reductive EQ, dynamic EQ, more de-essing, anything like that, you can go in where you feel need, but this is like the basic starter kit. From here, we're working on effects, which I recommend you put on a send. There's multiple reasons for that. That's another conversation, but now we're working with our effects. So we're going to set up some sends. On our first send, something that's very common is reverb. Not every vocal needs reverb. Some vocals need 4 reverbs. This is where you would do it in the chain. You don't want to do it towards the beginning most of the time, because then as you're compressing and EQing it, you're going to be compressing and EQing that reverb, which is another reason why you should put it on the send. But once again, another story. So here's where we're adding our effects. Things like reverb, very common. Also, another send, things like delay/echo, very common. This is where you would do those. You can also do doubling, flanging, phasing, distortion, parallel compression. There's a million effects you can do. This is where it's so variable, I can't even tell you. It's all your taste, your creativity. Maybe you don't want any effects at all. Maybe you're going to automate things. This is where there is no rules. This is where you go wild and get creative. This is that final 5% that pushes you across the finish line with your own flair. Takes your mix from sounds okay to, oh, he mixed that, or she mixed that, they mixed that, that's them. This is where you add your personal flair. I'm not even going to give you any suggestions here. You're going to run wild with this. All right, guys. So there it is. There is a general vocal chain for 2024, and honestly, all throughout the future and in the past. This is tried and true because of the philosophy behind it. Remember, it's always going to change. It's going to vary. So don't try to pin me into one of those clickbait YouTubers. I'm giving you the philosophy and the reasoning. You guys take it and run wild. Anyways, guys, hope you got something from that. Give me a like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe I'd appreciate it for keeping it real and not making a clickbait video, man. We're starving out here. I'd appreciate it. Inswain with Inswain Audio. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Peace.